Madman or rational actor? Strategist or chancer? We'll go deep into the mind of Vladimir Putin with Dr. Ian Robertson of Trinity College Dublin, a researcher and author who has looked at this subject before. Stay tuned.
You are watching In Conversation This Week with Miceal O'Hurley.
This is Miceal O'Hurley, and thank you for joining us for another episode of In Conversation This Week. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Ian Robertson of Trinity College Dublin. He is the author of How Confidence Works, a book that came out last year. We'll give you the links to it at the end. He's also written The Stress Test and The Winner Effect. We're here today to talk about a particular article he wrote, I think for Psychology Today, called The Danger That Lurks Inside Vladimir Putin's Brain. Dr. Robertson, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate you being here. Tell me, if you will, for a minute, what do you do for Trinity College Dublin in addition to all your other cross appointments?
So I'm a co-director of the Global Brain Health Institute, which is a joint leadership fellowship training program with University of California, San Francisco. We train people from all over the world, particularly from low and middle income countries, in how to develop policies and methods for improving brain health with the idea of preventing a certain number of cases of dementia over the next few decades. I'm also Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Trinity College Dublin.
Well, those are very distinguished credentials. So let me ask you, what led you to write that 2014 article about Putin?
So I became aware of the concept of power as a key psychological and biological variable. I hadn't thought about it till I was in a position of minor power myself as a university functionary, and I realized. And then an article came out about an experiment showing the effects of even tiny amounts of power on cognitive and brain function and emotional function. And I realized that when I was in that, I didn't particularly enjoy power, the limited power I had. I didn't particularly enjoy it. It wasn't part of my motivational structure, but that led me to think about power and its effects on the brain when you have large amounts of it. And that got me very interested in. Bertrand Russell wrote a book about power where he said that it's to social relations and human relations, it is to them what energy is to physics. It's the fundamental variable in trying to understand human relationships. So that led me to write a book called The Winner Effect. Fascinating research has been done all over the world on the effects of give great success, but also the power that people accumulate and how that affects their brains. And I started looking at the political leaders around me, and I realized that some of their decisions and behaviors showed abnormalities which could be interpreted in terms of what I understood by the science of how power affects the brain.
So you say that contempt is a big driver in Putin's view of other world leaders. Tell me about that.
Vladimir Putin, from what I understand, he grew up in very, very hard circumstances in St. Petersburg, as then Leningrad, and he was one of these guys. If you were a young man, you wouldn't particularly want to meet him in the street. He came from a rough end of town, and he was a bit of a thug. And then he then got into the KGB, as it was then, and really thrived in that culture. Now, the thing I would say about Soviet communism is there's an essential ethical core to it, which says that the end justifies the means. And that I think has had a huge influence on that whole part of the world and many different parts of the world. The sense that you're not really what you do is judged by its effects. And he became a great strong arm advocate of and very clever advocate of Soviet power, and he was personally very affected by its collapse when he was working in East Germany. So in terms of that, from that perspective, then from the KGB's perspective, it's all about power. It's all about being able to wield power without, there's little sense of senses of fairness or kind of international rules, or all these things don't really figure in the kind of moral background they came from, and for that reason, a leader who is looks weak because he or she has democratic problems or has been criticized for personal failing, the whole kind of interplay that happens in democracies, necessary interplay, and the kind of fragile periods that leaders go, that to him is just pathetic, as indeed I think to most authoritarian leaders, and I would include Xi and Erdogan in this. They just think this is, and there is a whole kind of homophobic, ultra masculine, kind of culture that goes with this, that has contempt for these supposedly more feminine, less masculine kind of vulnerabilities of the West. And so so that sense of would lead to a sense of contempt. So you get this in relationships as well, marital relationships. The great sign that this relationship is doomed is where any contempt creeps into either party, and that's true, in the psychology of Putin and other dictators. And we saw it, for instance, in Donald Trump. Donald Trump had expressed great, admiration for Trump, for Putin, and he, and for even Kim Jong Un, for people of that kind of authoritarian mindset, they respect only one thing, which is power and strength. And if you don't have that, obviously, for instance, by having a fragile alliance of consensus, then that leads to contempt. And that's a very dangerous emotion in relationships.
So we take a look now at a man who took the disintegration of the Soviet Union as a personal affront to all that his psyche stood for. And last summer's essay, which was quite verbose, in which he laid out his views that he sees it as his personal destiny to lead Russia back to a greater empire. I mean, he is an imperialist, not a nationalist. Yeah. Can he be viewed as a rational actor given these incredible dreams that would take a lot in reality to come to fruition?
Can I say, first of all, just that believing he has, I believe, at least superficially adopted the trappings of the Orthodox Church, and he takes part in various religious rituals sometimes, and he has this sense of destiny, as you say, which gives him a sense that he's not just exercising power in the way that a gang leader exercises power purely in order to hold that to the satisfaction of wielding that power. He does see himself as embodying an almost spiritual notion of the great Soviet Russian Empire, which has always had a degree of expansionism to it and imperialism, and so that is very alarming, because it means that some of the completely corrupting effects that power has on the brain, the distorting effects, is somewhat moderated by the fact that he feels he is doing this not just for him, for his own selfish reasons, but for the motherland, if you like. And whether he's a rational actor here, and it's terrible to use the term, but you just have to say it. But Adolf Hitler had similar huge aspirations and expansionist imperialist aspirations, but he eventually made some terrible decisions, not the least of which was deciding, like Napoleon, another dictator, to invade Russia, and then to only surround himself eventually with generals who couldn't say no to him, and then took over military command of the forces and ended up making some dreadful decisions. So I would say, no, I don't believe that Putin is an entirely rational actor here. That being said, he has played an incredibly clever game. He's played an incredibly clever game in the medium term. He's played a clever game, albeit brutal game in Syria. He's made himself, really his ambition to have three powers in the world, America, Russia, and China. He's delivered on that to some extent, because everyone in that part of the world now goes to Putin. But in the longer term, whether if there are terrible sanctions, if there is God help us, an expanded war, it will have been, as it was for Hitler, a terrible, clear lapse of judgment. But the answer is yes, partly, but actually, is he fully considering all the risks and all the consequences? No, he can't do, because he's not getting the full advice that he can, because he's created this highly authoritarian system of ultra isolation where he doesn't get alternative views.
One of the things I learned early in my career in Washington, in the halls of power, is that we were expected to speak truth to power. We were expected to say no and explain why no. I asked my old boss once, Senator Kennedy, why he kept me on his staff when he had so many brain trust already there. And he said, they can always tell me the answers. You tell me the questions. Is that sense of isolation that comes with being an authoritarian leader working to his detriment? And do you believe that he's fallen into the trap of assembling sycophants around him so that he may not be getting the best information?
I absolutely think that's likely to be the case. I've heard from a German journalist that if you get an appointment to see Putin, you have to go through this tunnel. But first of all, you have to have all your tests, etc. But you have to go through this tunnel where there's some kind of substance sprayed around you, and you come in, and here's this small man behind this big desk, and so Julius Caesar had himself deified while he was still alive. It is the fundamental trap of all very powerful leaders, that they feel themselves to be like godlike, and in that circumstance, you become, in your own mind, the only source of correct decisions and correct views. And the idea that there is any wisdom of crowds or even of small groups that can accumulate there becomes very difficult to take. And you develop a narcissism that means that anyone who says no or questions what you're doing is not just questioning your view, he's threatening your very, very fragile and inflated narcissistic ego. So that becomes any alternative. And that's why you get this dynamic of naysayers around people in that circumstance.
I have an article breaking tomorrow in which I take a look at how Russians have created iconography with Putin's face on it, something he hasn't discouraged. And even the Moscow Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church blesses Russians, including soldiers, as they kiss, as they venerate this icon of
Wow.
Putin.
Wow.
And there is iconography of Stalin. There's almost this sense of deification in lifetime that, despite Stalin's contempt for the Orthodox Church, he never dismissed their appraisal of him as an extremely powerful and strong, if not God-given leader.
Yeah.
What do you think that does to a psyche like Vladimir Putin? Does it further alienate him from reality?
Yes, it does. I mean, I remember going to Vietnam and going to see Ho Chi Minh's, corpse in the mausoleum there, and there was no doubt this was no different from Mezzogiorno, any of the kind of Catholic type of sites of veneration. It was a religious ritual without the theology around it. And I didn't know that about the iconography of Putin, but it makes me realize that it's even more likely that he will ignore and not consider potential risks for for Russia, but also for the world. It's a very worrying situation when you have someone feeling that they are godlike, which is what this is saying, because then, we know of the tendency of very, very people who are very religious. They will do all sorts of things in the belief that this is their destiny, including self-immolation and all sorts of stuff. So it definitely, the more it becomes a religious trappings of a religious calling and a sense of destiny, the more he gets divorced from reality, in my view.
In your 2014 article, you recount an episode in which Angela Merkel interacted with Putin. He was the master, and I think still is, of creating a crisis that then he could only be the answer to it, and therefore it necessitated a call from Europe's great leader, which was essentially Angela Merkel. What did Merkel say about Putin when she characterized that meeting?
Putin spoke not just about his interlocutors in the international stage, but about his own cabinet in derogatory terms, in contemptuous terms. And Merkel said to him, why do you speak about your colleagues so in such terms? And he was just absolutely dismissive. He would engage with Merkel because she was an economically powerful, woman, but she was one of the few kind of almost equals in this world that he inhabits. So even the people in his own entourage, he had contempt for them, which of course exacerbates this sense of isolation and sense of no one else's opinion has any value.
And I think you wrote that Merkel said that he was living in a different world. And you talk about the isolation in which authoritarians or dictators live. Did the COVID-19 crisis possibly contribute to that further alienation?
I think the answer to that is yes, from what I understand. And even with Macron coming to visit him, being them requiring him to have a COVID test, which he refused. And then this story about the long tunnel, the tunnel in with the spraying, this kind of notion of, and then even that ridiculous table when he met Macron, so he's apparently ultra hyper paranoid about being contaminated. And that's, of course, superficially about COVID, but it's much more than that. It's much more than that. So I do think that the COVID thing has added to this sense of this lonely, godlike, destiny-propelled figure doing this lonely mission in the world. I think COVID has exacerbated that.
Given his almost low church Protestant preordination view that Russia's greatness cannot happen without Putin, and Putin can't reach his greatness without Russia being reassembled into a somewhat imperial body. Are you surprised that his essay last summer spoke about the Ukrainians and the other Slavs, the Poles, the Baltics people, as being basically a subculture of Russia and not nations or peoples of themselves?
No, I'm not surprised by that. I think anyone speaking Russian is Putin's man or woman. You know, that's his constituency, and he feels that he has to bring that people, that Russian-speaking people, together. And you know, I mean, I've heard it said by Putin acolytes, of whom there are quite a few in this country, as in many other countries, or supporters, saying, "Oh, Ukraine isn't a real country. It's really just, you know," and that sent shivers down my spine, because I've heard, you know, people over in the UK and Northern Ireland say that about Ireland, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And but this was, you know, this is Irish, senior Irish people, well, one or two I can think of, saying that. And of course, that contributes to that sense of contempt, or that sense of justification of this, you know, culture manipulated by American money, you know, to go away from the true motherland. So no, you know, this won't end as long as Putin's in power. This constant attempt to push forward, to use all sorts of means to extend back into to recreate the Soviet Union, will not end.
You talked previously about whether he was a rational actor or not. And he has been quite masterful at getting great concessions with a Don Corleone kind of making people an offer they can't refuse. The implied threat gets concessions. And yet, if you look back over the last 20 years, each concession has only invited new concessions. Does the West's propensity to placate Putin fuel his desire or belief that he can get more?
I have no doubt about that whatsoever. And I'm just, the extent to which you placate him, or what he sees as a concession and a negotiation, is a sign of weakness. He only respects strength. He does not, there's no sense in which, okay, let's sit down and sort this out and come to negotiate solution. That is not in his mindset at all, which is why the Nord Stream gas project that, you know, Gerhard Schröder, with his 70th birthday in St. Petersburg, you know, the Germany has really got a big problem here with doing precisely that, appeasing, essentially, or giving concessions, of believing firmly he's a rational actor and will just come together. That, I believe, has been the prevailing, until very, very recently, the prevailing, particularly the Social Democrats in Germany, the prevailing kind of view. And the, you know, what they see as the Anglo-Saxon view of kind of, look, you have to hold the line here. The only thing he respects is strength, which is true. Absolutely. It's only now they're beginning to say, hold on a minute, maybe he is serious about this. So yeah, um, con- con- the concessions that liberal democracies would tend to make in trying to arrange something really don't work within Putin's world, I don't believe.
Ian, let's take Emmanuel Macron.
Yes.
He's handsome, thin, well coiffed. His suits are finely tailored. He must come across as the kind of effeminate leader that Putin despises. Would I be wrong in that assessment?
I've no idea what he thinks about Macron. Um, he might have a little bit of respect for Macron because he has a nuclear arsenal. He might have respect for Macron because, I mean, he has contempt for the European Union and did his best, by funding Brexit activities to get, weaken it by getting Britain out. But to the extent that Macron is at least stepping up, I mean, he met with him for quite a long time, unlike his phone call with Boris Johnson. So I couldn't be certain that he wouldn't whether I don't know how he sees Macron. He will certainly see him as an inferior in this unidimensional power world that he inhabits. But to the extent that Macron was, I guess, giving the impression that he was giving him respect, that's the only other thing that would buy you some positive view in Macron's world. If you kind of recognize him, he wants to be seen as one of the three great leaders of the world: America, China, and Russia. So to the extent that you kind of imply or say or give him that respect, then maybe he will not have contempt for you because you have a certain amount of power in your country, unlike your cabinet, which is there just entirely in your disposal. So I mean, so he likes getting leaders coming, like Belarusian leader coming, and even though he probably looks down on them, there'll be a certain positive response because they're giving him due deference.
I actually believe that Macron has shown strong leadership. He stepped into a gap, not only because of the presidency of Europe at this time, the chairmanship of France's leadership, but because he's filled the vacuum left by Merkel as a senior European leader. He's said the right things. He's coordinated very closely with allies within the European Union, NATO, the transatlantic partners. But I go back to the idea that he may not be the person to negotiate with a character like Putin, because Putin only admires Kim Jong-un, Xi, and other leaders because they're overtly strong, masculine, if you will. It's hard to say that about Kim Jong-un, but there is that sense that power connotes approval with Putin. Would we be better off taking a look at a negotiator like Erdogan, who is seen as a strong man in his region? And is he a better negotiating partner with someone like Putin?
Perhaps in that psychological sense, perhaps, but not really, because he doesn't have an arsenal. He has an army, but he's a local player, not a global player. And so he doesn't have the trappings of military power and economic power. So so you might get some counterbalance. Yes, psychologically, he wants to deal man to man with this great, macho, person who knows how to call the shots in their country. Yeah, there'll be that. But on the other hand, you say, well, Turkey, look at the economy. It's it's in a terrible state, and they don't have any nuclear weapons. So. We're and then you've got Joe Biden, of course, with who's a lower approval rating, if we believe the Russian, than Putin has himself. So in his own country. So Putin's done a great job at weakening democracy, and he hates democracy. He hates democracy because it has contaminated his Russian, his hinterland. And of course, like COVID, it's a huge threat to him personally, to his very, very fragile ego.
When I take a look at the Russian economy, if you could call it an economy, it's smaller than the state of Texas.
Yeah.
It's dysfunctional. Last time I was in Moscow and St. Petersburg, 50 kilometers outside of the cities, which would look like any other European city, full of luxury cars and modern buildings, you run into a rural poverty that still remains from post-World War II era, with dilapidated housing, a lack of infrastructure. So here's a man who hasn't built Russia internally over the 30 years that other countries have advanced. It's all been about military might and power and this projection of rebuilding the empire. We have now Putin saying to Ukraine, you can't join NATO. In fact, we want NATO to roll everything back to 30 years ago when we were still a great power player. Is that delusional or is it strategic?
He's both delusional and he's a rational actor here, because he's got something like 800 billion in reserves because of the oil prices. So as John McCain described him, he is a thug with a gas station, and the reason this religious persona and this kind of sense of Russian destiny is, it's bread and circuses, for people. His approval ratings are high. He controls the media almost absolutely. Any political opponents, look at poor old Navalny. So to an extent, he is an old-fashioned tyrant who manages to keep under. The protests that happened in the last elections, they were just ruthlessly put down, and that's my fear about the modern world is. But where before, you might say in a place like Venezuela, popular discontent will throw the tyrant over. With modern technology, tyrants can control vast swathes of people much more effectively than they ever could in the past. So I'm pessimistic about a kind of notion of the dynamics of popular unrest will unseat them. I think that's much harder. Look at the Venezuelan government still in place after all of that, and the Cubans run the identity card system for the armed forces and everything. So it's all very, very tightly controlled, and then facial recognition, the social credit system of Xi in China. I think that if I was Putin, I'd be thinking, yeah, I've got 800 billion in reserves. Okay, I may be spending several billion with this armed forces build up. I got all this money. I can expand my arsenal even more. And yeah, these kind of people living in miserable conditions in the country, let them complain. And it's not. This is a spiritual journey to make Russia great again, in my view. I'm putting words in his mouth audaciously.
I think very good ones, though.
Yeah.
Ian, I agree with you. A functional, democratic, prospering Ukraine on his border is anathema to him, because it creates the danger that the Russian people will interact with it, see it, desire it, and want to embrace it. And I think that's why he tried to kill Navalny, and why he imprisoned him, why he shut down all of those riots and demonstrations in advance of this overtly military move. The two, in my mind, go hand in hand. He wanted to make sure there was no domestic challenge at home, which brings me to the last point I want to talk about. Putin once cooperated with the West, according to his mind, on the issue of Libya. And it morphed into regime change. Gaddafi ends up dying. The country falls into chaos. He saw what happened to a former strongman dictator, authoritarian, and he hated Hillary Clinton for it.
Yeah.
He hated the United States and the West for it because it might portend what his future would be.
Yeah.
To what extent is he driven by fear that now is his last best chance, while Europe is still dependent on Russia for fossil fuels and gas, and while he is still young enough to exert control with these billions in reserves, as you say, having quashed a domestic dissent, how much should we worry that he sees this as his last big chance and he will gamble everything to achieve his goals?
I fear that that is absolutely the case. I fear that is the case, that all autocrats, all tyrants are inevitably driven by fear. I mean, all the people that have been killed, Litvenko and Navalny was nearly killed. All these ghosts. It's like Macbeth. All the ghosts are gathering, and so inevitably, and hence this kind of extreme COVID and extreme. There's a fear inevitably comes there, and then you see Gaddafi being shot, being murdered, rolled about. You think, oh my God. So it is, and then he sees, okay, the West is moving. In 20 years, the renewables, they won't be nearly as dependent on my gas. My negotiating power is now, my military power is now. So I do think he feels this is part of his destiny, that I'm the man at this time in history to do this, and that's why I've been, where other people have been sanguine about his military build-up thing. It's just I'm less sanguine about it. I do think it will take. I think he probably will have some incursion into Ukraine, probably within a few days. It's a very, very alarming situation. The whiff of Munich comment by one of the British Minister of Defence. I think there is that whiff about it, I'm afraid.
Russia has such contempt for Ireland and its neutrality that it staged games with the Russian naval fleet in Ireland's exclusive economic zone, after having polluted them and denying it in their 2009 games. You have the German Chancellor, who is highly dependent on Nord Stream 2. As you say, Schroeder sits on the board. These are disciples of Schroeder's. Germany doesn't seem to have an appetite to confront Russia.
No.
They believe an Ostpolitik will continue to work. Even though a German court in December found that the Russian state ordered the murder of a refugee in a busy Berlin park where families gather. We know about the Skripal poisonings. We know about polonium. We know about the attempts in Montenegro to take out the prime minister. By any measure, Putin is a state sponsor of terror.
Yeah.
And yet, Europe, which often cites European values as driving it, human rights and dignity, continues to do business with him on an ongoing basis, to the extent that last week, German business groups, realizing their ties to Russia and their profitability with cheap energy and other resources, clamored to send a message to the new Chancellor, Scholz, that they don't want Germany to take a firm position with Russia.
Yeah.
What is it about Western leaders that they continue to think that they can deal with Vladimir Putin and that his word means anything?
Yeah. And 11 members of the British cabinet have received donations from Russians in Britain. So I think Germany was denazified hugely successfully after the Second World War, and a whole in their anxiety to avoid all that terrible history, they built up a set of liberal values and an approach to life that is inimical to this the idea that you would have a kind of robust kind of defend your country nationalism that, say, it pertains or has pertained in America, less so now. And so the culture of the European Union has been one. This is about trade. This is about liberal values. This is about social protection. The whole notion of defence has been totally left to those countries who have with an experience, like France and the UK and Germany has been hamstrung by this, and of course Ireland has no defence whatsoever and has been off the coattails of whatever defence Europe has. And so I do think that and now it seems to be that Germany are suddenly saying, hold on a minute, he might invade, whereas before I believe the prevailing attitude was, look, this is just negotiation, let's just talk business, money will sort this. Money is not the major thing here. This is not a means of trade. This is a spiritual imperial process, and Europe is going to have to get its act together. And of course, one of the effects that Putin's behavior has had is to create a certain greater degree of harmony among the NATO allies. But how long? God help us if Trump gets in again. That's gone. We really have to then bend over and just accept, that we are, a lesser hinterland of this great Soviet imperium.
And this is my worry. You have Iran who says, why should we re-enter into the JCPOA, the Iran nuke deal? We don't know if you're going to be a stable partner in the future.
Yeah.
And that's a valid criticism. Yeah. And for Europe to continue to do business with a bloodthirsty nation like the Russian Federation, with a leader like Vladimir Putin, undermines its core values, and if not its future. And I think Germany's going to have to reckon with whether it ends up again on the wrong side of history. So these are difficult times. I continue to be bemused by European leaders believing that Vladimir Putin, who signed the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty, recognizing them as a free and independent state, so that they gave up the only nuclear arsenal in the world that's ever been voluntarily put beyond use. Yeah. The idea that he could be a reliable partner in the future, to me, seems inimical to the truth. And I think it sends a seriously bad signal to places like North Korea. Why would I give up nuclear ambitions? No, right. Ukraine did, and look what happened.
Exactly.
And in a sense, I think Europe's future will rise and fall on this moment in Ukraine. Whether we realize it or not, this is a moral reckoning point for Europe's future. Any last thoughts?
Just to say that, yes, he betrayed Ukraine, the Budapest Agreement, but also he feels betrayed by the West. He believes that Russia was given undertakings that NATO would not encroach on former, that they would not advance. So he was, remember that he was part of G8 for a while. There was a time when he was positively disposed to the West. So he believes the Iraq War was the most appalling act of recklessness, which it was, of course. So it's not entirely one-sided in that there's this gap of mistrust and mutual betrayal that's perceived here.
I spoke to one of the plenipotentiaries from Poland to the OSCE chairmanship, and he said that what has fundamentally been lacking in Europe over the past decade or more has been confidence-building measures. And as you say that, Ian, I think you've touched the problem with a pin. There is a fundamental lack of trust, but even if it were to be rebuilt, I would still remain concerned that Putin's imperialistic ambitions are so bound up with his personal sense of destiny and his reason for being, his raison d'etre, that whatever happens in Ukraine, I think we will continue to revisit this expansionism and aggression as long as Putin stays in office.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
Do me a favor, remind me of your latest book, tell me what it's about, and where can people find it?
So my book is called How Confidence Works, the New Science of Self-Belief. And the thesis is that what makes us uniquely human is our ability to imagine things that don't exist in the future and work towards them. Confidence is the fuel for that. It is critical for individuals, but it's also critical for communities, for groups, for companies, and for countries to feel collective confidence. So it's an analysis of the neuroscience of confidence. It's published by Penguin in London.
Great. We'll put the link up. It's on Amazon. Where else do you get books these days?
Yeah.
Booksellers are almost gone. I look forward to reading it because your other works were very informative and they stand the test of time. This is Miceal O'Hurley with Diplomacy in Ireland, the European Diplomat. On In Conversation this week, we've been speaking with Dr. Ian Robertson of Trinity College Dublin, a psychologist with many accolades. He's got a new book out. Look for it. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Miceal.
Thank you very much. Stay safe. We'll talk to you soon.